All righty. So we're here today to talk about planning clocking domains for Dante, Q-LAN, and AES67. We're going to take a few minutes. We're going to talk about what is PTP, why are we doing this, what is the reasons behind this, and we're going to run through some scenarios with Q-SYS, specifically Q-SYS Designer, and how to set up successful systems and sort of understand the nuances with all the different clocking settings that we've got. So getting into this, let's talk about, we're going to talk a little bit about what sort of PTP is. There's two really big time protocols out on the interwebs, as it were. The network time protocol and precision time protocol. Network time protocol has been around since 1981. Couple of really big things. It is always software timestamping. The accuracy is only about a millisecond. And the client pulls time from a server. In other words, time is not really created or not created. You have a time server that hosts that time for all the devices that are connected to it. Precision time protocol, big thing. You have a leader or a clock master that basically tells everybody else what to do. It is a relative time. So if that clock master is not talking to a time server to get atomic time, you're still going to have a system that's synced up and in time relatively with itself. Your accuracy, you have up to 100 nanoseconds. That's pretty impressive on a network. And for most of the time stamping, it's actually hardware time stamping. PTP does support software time stamping, but the hardware time stamping allows people to create a piece of hardware and actually test how it affects PTP and how it affects the clocking and how it clocks, and then be able to sort of document that information, back out to the rest of the system. So talking about this, there's three different versions of PTP. For the most of this class, we are going to be talking about PTP v2, but just giving you sort of an idea. PTP v1 came out around 2002, PTP v2 2008, PTP v2.1 2019. We can sort of use PTP v2.1 and 2 pretty interchangeably because 2.1 is backwards compatible to 2. The one big thing about this is PTP v1 and PTP v2 are not compatible to each other. They come up with their clock leader data differently. They send different packets on the network. They sync to time differently. They literally have nothing to do with each other, but they have been sort of engineered to coexist on the same network. All right, so PTP v2. We're looking at basically what happens on the network and what the messages are. PTP v1 is Dante, although I hear a rumor that Dante is actually going to be switching to PTP v2 soon. I'm not really sure when that's going to be, but the rumor came from somebody that works for Audinate, so we'll just leave it at that. PTP v2 is Q-LAN AES67, SMPTE ST2110. There's a lot of others that sort of fall into the two categories, but these are the ones that we're most concerned about. You need multicast. One interesting thing about PTP v1 is it is only multicast. And PTP v2 actually uses multicast, but can also send unicast packets or unicast messages, which actually allows us to get communication between devices that isn't actual clocking communication. And then let's see, anything else we want to talk about for this slide? We're going to talk a little bit more about jitter coming up, so I don't think we need to talk a little bit more about this, but I think knowing how the communication happens between a leader or a clock master and all of the followers is pretty important. So we're going to look at this. So you see this little graphic, and we're going to actually make this graphic make a little bit more sense here. Basically, what's happening is you have somebody that's the clock leader on your network, and somebody that is actually following the clock leader. And in order to follow the clock leader, they have to do a little bit of math that says, hey, how is my time different from their time? Again, if it's a hardware amount of, if you're using hardware to do your time and your clocking, then you actually have to be able to come up with a way to say, how am I off? And then the follower can adjust using that sort of calculated time offset. So you can sort of see here what that looks like. We're not going to get into a lot more detail about this, but knowing this and knowing what's happening is pretty important. What's really fun is if you go into Wireshark, you can actually see all of these messages, and you can actually see the contents of the message and sort of the math that's being created as all of the followers sort of create their offset and then adjust themselves to match up with the clock leader. Um,
And those
one real
followers, that offset's affected by how many switch hops they make and things like that, right? Just everything that's inherent in electronics
Everything that's
for
inherent in
transmitting
electronics.
audio. Yeah.
Yep. And some devices actually will calculate an offset and send it on down to the next device in line. A transparent clock won't actually affect the delay, but it'll say, okay, here's the time the request came in, here's the time the request is going out, so that something downstream from a transparent clock can actually include the transparent clock's timing in its own offset. So there's lots of nuance here, and you can go in and get into a lot of detail with this, but I think that just understanding what's going on the network is really important to know when we start talking about some of our Q-SYS specific scenarios. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to get into some of those scenarios and start unpacking a little bit of what I just talked about and applying it to some of our specific items and scenarios. Um, the first scenario that we've got here is we have two Core 110s, soon to be Core 24Fs, right? Everybody knows. We have two cores, and the two cores have no peripherals attached to them. Say you have a core in a room, and it's just analog audio out, analog audio in, no network audio, no Dante, no Q-LAN, no AES67. Um, why are we talking about this? This is we're talking about clocking domains, and I'm literally giving you a scenario with no clocking domain. Um, I think it's really important to understand this about Q-SYS Designer and about Q-SYS devices. If there is no network audio, and you can see in the file, we've just got analog I/O and we've got VoIP, which is not gonna need clocking. The core won't actually engage in the PTP conversation that's happening on the network. Now, remember, we looked at all those communications going back and forth, but if there is no need for it, QSYS inherently will just not do it. It's really kind of a nice feature because if you have a system, say you have those two cores and one of the cores has a bunch of digital audio going in and out and the other one doesn't, you don't actually have a PTP conflict because the one that doesn't isn't going to join in the PTP conversation. So just being aware of that scenario is pretty important to Q-SYS Designer because it will give you a little bit of ammunition of like, well, why is your core doing this on the network? Well, it's not because there's nothing to do. So pretty important thing to know. All right. So now let's get to the real world because cores don't actually tend to only be the only thing in a network. And we're going to look at scenario 2, which is having actual Q-LAN peripherals. So no Dante devices, no AES67 devices. Each core has an IO8 flex, which we want to somehow at some point make that a QIO box. But I still maintain, just for the record, the IO8 Flex is one of my favorite Q-SYS devices ever made. So we have a Core 110 and an IO8 Flex, and it's two different systems. So we have two cores, and each core has a peripheral attached to it. So now we actually get into having communications and having all those clock messages going back and forth on the network. And now we need to talk about how they all, yeah, thanks, Aaron. It is king. Aaron just put in the Q&A, the IO8 Flex is king. I swear it's one of my favorite boxes because it had USB for conferencing. So you could throw that thing anywhere. Um, so we're going to get back into how do the two cores in the two systems understand who's going to be the clock leader? How do we hold that election? How do those messages go back and forth and make this determination on the network? To be sort of, we're going to go back. To be blunt about it, if all things are equal, the lowest MAC address will win the election. And we're going to talk about the BMCA in a little bit more detail in the next scenario. So bear with me on that one. We'll come back to it. But knowing that if you have two identical Core 110s, most of their defaults are all going to be identical unless somebody's gone in and changed something. So with all those defaults being the same, the lowest MAC address wins. Now, how does the lowest MAC address win? There's actually sort of a hash made of the MAC address. And whichever of those hashed numbers is the lowest number is actually what wins the clock election. So in this scenario, our core 1 has the lowest MAC address, and it will win, and it becomes the clock leader. And it's actually the clock leader for core 1, core 2, flex 1, and flex 2. So being aware that once it becomes the clock leader on the network, all the devices are going to sync to it. And you're saying to yourself in your head, well, but Flex 2 is actually attached to Core 2. Sure, but there's only one clock leader on our network because everything is talking, everything is in the same network. Flex 2 is actually going to get its timing and be a follower to Core 1 for our Grandmaster clock. So scenario 3, we have our same Q-LAN with peripherals, but we want to sort of understand and unpack a little bit because we want to be real specific about which one of our cores becomes the clock leader in this situation. So we're going to stop here and have a couple of definitions and then sort of talk about how we can make that happen. First things first, I want to sort of talk about what a PTP port is. Everybody says, starts talking about PTP and PTP priorities and all of that, but understanding that multiple PTP port, it's just a network port, right? So IP address, port number. Multiple ports can exist on a single NIC, and a couple of rules, and these rules are really important. You can be a leader on multiple ports. You cannot be a follower on multiple ports. So if you're thinking, ahead of like you have a device that is talking to Dante and to AES67, you can have two ports open, one to PTPv1, one to PTPv2, and that device can be a leader on both of those ports, but it cannot be a follower on both of those ports. So these two rules are sort of really important when you're starting to think through boundary clock situations and how devices are going to be talking amongst themselves. Keep those two little things in your head at all times. It's pretty important to know that. Then we're going to talk next about the BMCA, which stands for Best Master Clock Algorithm. Anytime a device that's going to engage in PTP communication joins the network or leaves the network, the BMCA will run. In all reality, it's pretty much running all the time. But anytime any PTP scenario on the network changes, it's going to say, okay, we've had a change. I need to figure out if I need to do anything with the clock. So it runs this algorithm. One really important thing to know between PTPv1 and PTPv2, PTPv2 has what's called an announce message. PTPv1 has what's called a sync message. And one of the big differences is when they actually start determining who is the clock leader, PTPv1, you actually listen to the sync message. PTPv2, you actually listen to the announce message. The announced message is sort of what initiates the BMCA algorithm to run. And it basically is a message that gets put out on the network that says, hi, I want to participate in the PTP conversation that's happening, and here's my information. And then at that point, this algorithm will run, and you'll see a whole bunch of things in the algorithm. And basically, the other thing to remember about this is the lowest value will win. So if you have a number of 255 and a number of 254, 254 wins. If you have a number of 7 and you have a number of 6, 6 wins. So we're going to run down these and just talk about what they all are real quick. Priority 1. Priority 1 is a manually configurable number from 0 to 255. And again, lowest value wins. And it is the first thing that gets looked at. So it is the thing that will basically bypass the rest of the BMCA. So if I say, take one of my cores and I give it a PTP priority 1 value of 1, it's going to win. It's always going to win. Doesn't matter what any of the other stuff is, it's going to win. So that's one of the things that in Q-SYS Designer, we actually have manual control over and can adjust with regularity and change to suit the needs of our network. Class. The class is really saying what kind of source the clock has. Just a note, the default value is 248. But there are some really interesting things in the class conversation that actually affects if you want to adjust PTP priority 1 or PTP priority 2. And one of them is if you're connected to a true GPS clock. Usually a GPS clock has a class of 6. Which means that it's going to win. So if you've given Q-SYS core a priority PTP priority value 1 of 1, and you've got a GPS clock that you actually want to be the clock leader, you need to go back in and go reset that PTP priority 1 so that it's not actually impeding, and let that class value of 6 determine the clock leader in your algorithm. Accuracy, how accurate the clock is to true time. Every clock, even an atomic clock, has some deviation from actual time. So this is an accuracy value that it's not really a variable. It's sort of a hardware. How accurate is this hardware? And then once you sort of come up with how accurate that is, that's a number that really just on a piece of gear that doesn't deviate. The lower the number, the more accurate the clock is. And I'm going to hold because we have a question. Does this algorithm run separately on each device? It actually runs on the network. It's actual network traffic. So those messages and those clocking messages that are going back and forth, it's that announce message. And the announce message actually goes out and everybody gets the announce message and they sort of say, okay, well, that's a better clock than I am, or it's not as good a clock. I'm going to continue being the clock leader. So it really is network traffic. It's not really a separate algorithm on each individual device. Each individual device does get the announce message and run a comparison. But it's the traffic that's going back and forth on the network that actually determines which device becomes the clock master. That's a nuance, I know, but I wanted to take a second and answer that question. The variance is the stability. Because PTP v2 is more a relative clock as opposed to an absolute clock like an NTP server is, you actually have a variance or the amount of drift over time. Again, the lower the number, the better. That variance is also a hardware thing, like it's something that gets tested and sort of documented. But this variance, if it goes too high, can actually inject jitter too. So just be aware that variance and accuracy, two different things. Accuracy is how accurate, and the variance is sort of how much it drifts over time. And then we get to priority 2. Priority 2 is also a manually configurable number, but just know where it is in the list. We're going to talk a lot for this, next half hour about PTP v2 priority 1 values, but just know that, there are scenarios where you want to leave the PTP priority 1 at its default and actually adjust PTP priority 2. because you may want something else to be your clock leader, or you may want some other set of data to influence what is the clock leader in a system. And then we have this unique identity, and this unique identity is an 8 byte number. Sorry, I always say the wrong thing there, which is that sort of hash of the MAC address. The lowest value wins, and then once the BMC algorithm finishes, the master clock sends sync messages. So whoever gets the leader starts sending out those sync messages, which is the 4 time messages that we sort of looked at the beginning of this class. Couple of other things to be aware of. Q-SYS has some default values. The default value for a Q-SYS core for PTP priority 1 is 254. The default value for a Q-SYS peripheral PTP priority 1 is 255. We've sort of engineered it so that every single time we do something, the core is always going to become the clock leader. We don't want Q-LAN peripherals taking over. Other things,
Angela,
yeah.
we have a quick statement from John
Yep.
Gentry, but I think it's important to bring up. He says, I've had issues with Shure MX devices taking over and fighting for leader, even if the core is set to a high priority.
I'll answer that. It's actually a question that's in a statement. I'm going to answer that. Let me finish what I was going to say, and then we'll get into that.
Perfect. Perfect.
Last thing to note, the PTP priority 2 value, default value for both cores and peripherals is 100. Oof. If I hadn't finished that, my ADD would have really freaked out. I'm sorry, John. So let's talk about one thing to know, and we're going to get into this a little bit more when we start talking about boundary clocks. When you deal with PTP-v1 devices, and sometimes, the Shure MX device, the first thing when somebody says a statement like what John said is, the first question I asked is, have you turned on AES67 or not? In other words, are you just talking to PTP-v1 or are you talking to PTP-v1 and v2? Have you allowed that Shure device to sort of act as a boundary clock and allowing it to talk on the PTP-v2 side, which you can then go in and actually change some of those values? So one thing, one number to be aware of is 127. That's kind of the number of doom, just to tell everybody. 127 is the default PTP value for PTP-v1 devices that are trying to talk to PTP-v2. If on the PTP-v1 side, they are the clock leader, they're going to essentially have a PTP priority 1 value of 127. And that means that, if you look at a core where the default PTP priority 1 value is 254, that's where they're going to start fighting for the clock leader situation. That's one of those where you've got to be really aware, and you can force the issue by simply lowering the PTP priority 1 value of your core to something less than 127. And 127 is sort of that magic number in this PTP priority 1, where a lot of devices will want to be the clock leader and their defaults are set at 127. I don't know why that's happened. I think Shure did a thing back in the day and they just sort of turned this into a little bit of a standard, but that number is really important to know. You can see that in the Dante controller software. If you actually use Dante Domain Manager, you can actually change that value, but you have to be running Dante Domain Manager, which is a whole other thing that we're not going to talk about today, but you can Google it and see what that is. I will at some point in here throw up the difference between the BMCA for PTP-v2 and the PTP-v1 sort of clock algorithm. They are dramatically different. That's also another reason why they're not really compatible with each other. And that really affects what that situation is with the Shure mics. That was a lot. Sorry. That was a rabbit hole. So back to our scenario. Our scenario where we have 2 cores and 2 peripherals, and we want to sort of determine which one wins. We can say, I want core 2 to be the clock leader. because core one is, off in some weird space, and I don't necessarily want to, it might get turned off, something might happen with that. So in this situation, this specific scenario, if we change that PTP priority one value to 100, then core two automatically will win the BMCA. And regardless of what the MAC address is, because we've now interrupted that at the first value in the BMCA algorithm, our core will now be the clock leader. Whew. All right, so scenario 4, same scenario, but now we want to make sure in this particular situation that core 1 and core 2 can be the clock leader for their own peripherals. And remember what I said about how many clock leaders and how many followers. You can have multiple followers, or you can't have multiple followers on multiple NICs, but you can have multiple leaders. That doesn't apply here. However, we can actually start looking at domains, and it's something that we haven't talked to up until this point. And it's really important. Right above this PTP priority one, you see PTP v2 domain. The default is 0. The default is 0 because Audinate talks to that default of 0. So straight across the board, the PTP v1 devices can talk to PTP v2 on domain 0. They can't talk to PTP v2 on other domains. So it's really important to know that. I do think if you use Dante Domain Manager, you actually can adjust that. But without Dante Domain Manager, anything that's in the PTP-v1 world can talk to PTP-v2, but only on domain 0. So talking specifically about our scenario, this particular scenario, we only have Q-LAN devices, so we don't really care about PTP-v1. And we just want to make sure that core 1 talks to peripheral 1 and core 2 talks to peripheral 2, and they don't share clocking information. One sort of really just a side note on PTP v2, you can have multiple PTP v2 domains on the same network and the same subnet. They kind of ignore each other. Once the announce message comes out that says I'm in this domain, anything that's listening in a different domain just ignores all those messages. So kind of a cool thing where on the same network you can actually split up clock masters between, say, 2 conference rooms in a building and use this domain difference to do it. Just be aware that if you do have Dante devices, you have some limitations, and there's ways around it, and you can sort of work with it, but knowing what your parameters are is pretty important. So if we go into, say, core 1, and we say, core 1, we're going to leave you at domain 0. Core 2, we're going to put you to domain 1. All of a sudden, they're going to ignore each other. And the devices that are talking to core 1 are going to clock to core 1. Core 1 will be the clock leader for that network. And core 2 will talk to its own devices and be the clock leader for its network. And it's a real quick and easy thing that you can do as long as you're not sort of sending values or sending audio between all these cores or trying to have them share data or anything. And really, if you would think of 2 conference rooms that are on the same network, this is a pretty nice scenario. This can sort of be a nice get out of jail free card for devices and making sure that your clock leader isn't sort of bouncing around. So you can see that's exactly what we're going to do. Get them into 2 different domains. The PTPV1 priority 1 value doesn't matter. Because remember, by default, the core is 254, the peripheral is 255, so the core will automatically win the clock algorithm on each of its domains. All right, moving on. Now we're going to start getting into some scenarios where we are in fact combining Dante, AES67, Q-LAN, or as I like to call it, the real world where you're going to have all of these things on a network, and you need to be able to actually understand all of these things. So I have I had a show and tell thing to show, but I can't find it right now. I'll see if I come back. Um, when we get into having Dante devices and Q-LAN devices and AES67 devices, it's really important to know what chipset is in your device. You can always find that in the Dante software. It'll tell you what the firmware is. It'll tell you what the chip is. You can go in and sort of look at the devices and understand that. And somewhere I have a really nice chart that I got from the Audinate folks that lay out all the chips and what all they can do and can't do. And if we have time at the end, I'll go find it for everybody. Particular scenario. So we have a UND6IOBT, AES67 with an Ultimo X chip in it. And then we have an old one. We have this legacy UNDX4i with just an Ultimo. And again, you can Google what all the chipsets are, but the chipsets are pretty important, as is the Dante firmware. So what's going to be our clock leader? How do we sort of force the issue and get the clock leader to where we want it to be? These are pretty important questions. So first things first, we have to talk about what a boundary clock is. A boundary clock can talk to, again, remember we talked about PTP communications, that you can have multiple PTP ports basically on a single NIC. What a boundary clock does is, say we take that UND6IOBT, it only has one network port on it, but it can open up multiple ports. It's going to have a port that is talking to PTPv1, and it's going to have a port that's talking to PTPv2. And it will become sort of the bridge or boundary clock between those two protocols. You can have the boundary clock be the leader on both PTPv1 and PTPv2. Remember, you can actually be a leader on multiple, but you can't be a follower on multiple. So boundary clocks have three possible configurations. They can be the clock leader on V1 and V2. They can be the clock leader on V1 and a follower on V2. They can be the clock leader on V2 and a follower on V1. In the boundary clock situation, they very rarely end up being the follower on PTPv1. They usually end up being the clock leader for the PTPv1 side of things. That all said, devices with AES67 enabled, they use PTPv1 for most of their synchronization with Dante devices, but with the AES67 side enabled, they actually can talk to PTPv2. So that enabling PTPv2 allows them to all of a sudden be that boundary clock, as opposed to, I'm only on PTPv1 and I'm going to ignore all the PTPv2 clock messages. And that's that chipset thing. That was a pretty big change. I don't know when change happened with Audinate. Dan, I don't know if you know, let us know, but that change of the chipset and allowing AES67 to be turned on at the chipset level so that it will talk to PTPv2 was a pretty massive change, and a good one, quite honestly. It allowed Dante to really play nice with AES67. And in Dante, we got a little screenshot here in Dante controller where you can sort of see where you can enable that. You generally don't need to worry about the multicast address, because those things are pretty fixed ranges that the device will automatically adjust. But just enabling AES67, going back to talking about the Shure MX stuff, if you've got like an MXA920, going in and enabling AES67 mode allows you to have a little bit of configuration control over the PTPv2 side of the house. It also allows you to use that 920 as a boundary clock to talk to any Dante only devices that you have in your system. So always a good thing to come into some of these devices. If they allow you to enable AES67, it really does help you out a lot. All right. So getting back here to our actual scenario, Really interesting thing that the UND6IOBT becomes not only our clock leader, but our boundary clock. And it is a clock leader on both PTP-V1 and V2. Like I just talked about, you can be a clock leader on multiple ports. Do we want that? Do we want a wall plate to be our clock leader? I'm not sure that we do. Wall plates tend to get a lot of abuse, and in a system, they also tend to be something that changes more than, say, a core would change. So I think what we want to do is take a step back and understand how we can manipulate things in Q-SYS Designer to actually get our core to be our not only our boundary clock, but our clock leader in this situation with the same sort of set of equipment in here. All right. So we have the same set of gear. And right now, we're going to walk through how we're going to make the core our clock leader. Which brings up sort of one of the last big concepts we're going to talk about, which is enabling and using software-based Dante on a Q-SYS core. Up till now, we've talked about our cores as being devices that talk to PTP v2 and exclusively talk to PTP v2. Well, we have a way to actually allow our cores to talk to PTP v1, and that is our software-based Dante. How do we make that happen? Add it to your inventory. Add it to your inventory, drag in the block, and all of a sudden, that core now has to talk to Dante. And it's only going to be able to talk to Dante on PTP-V1. So we've now made our core capable of becoming a boundary clock because it's now talking PTP-V2 for Q-LAN and AES67 and PTP-V1 for the software Dante. This is kind of a fun thing. Like, if you really want to, I'm just going to give a real world example here and we'll walk through the rest of this scenario. I recently did a pretty big project in the Northwest for a pretty big customer. We did a building, which was their executive briefing center, and the building had, I want to say 32 cores in it. And as you can imagine, it was a flat network. All cores were talking on the same network. And as you can imagine, we had some issues with clocking. And one of the things that we did to fix this was we actually took, I think it was a Core Nano, put it in an IDF, added a software Dante block, and turned that Core Nano into the clock leader and the boundary clock. And we settled down the entire system for the price of a Core Nano. And it was crazy. I mean, you know, the number of devices, we had Dante, we had AES67 devices, we had Q-LAN devices, we had everything on this very, very flat network. So software Dante, again, once you add that into your file, it will allow your core to act as that boundary clock and talk to both clocking domains. All right, I lost my mouse for a second there. So, situation here, all we've done is we've added software Dante to core 1. Our UND6IOBT is still ending up being the clock leader. That's fine. But now our boundary clock is actually the core. So we've got half of what we're trying to do, we've got accomplished literally by just throwing a software Dante block into our file. Why doesn't the core win the clock leader? Well, the PTP priority is still set to 254. We're still at the default level there. So if this device is like all typical sort of Dante devices, it's 127 and it's going to win the clock leader. So what's really happening here is the UND6IOBT is the clock leader. It's giving clocking information to the core through that boundary clock, PTP-V1, and then the core is actually giving that clock information to all the other PTP-V2 devices. In this situation, you might think that the core 1 is actually acting as the clock leader for PTP-V2. Well, it sort of is. It sort of is, but it's actually passing through that information and the clock details from the UND6IOBT. All righty. So now how do we fix that? How do we make it so our clock is the master? Same identification of things, same list of equipment, and all right, Aaron, I'll stop. When running redundant cores, is it best to use something other than one of the cores as the clock leader? I'm going to answer that later because we actually have a scenario that we're going to get to here in a few minutes that actually talks about that. So I won't forget about you, Aaron.
Put a
Um,
cork in it, Aaron.
Greetings from Ohio. Are you
Great.
actually? He did. He very at the very beginning of this, he put greetings from Ohio.
Oh,
I don't think Aaron's in Ohio. Where is he? Are you in Cleveland? He'll answer later. Um, now the rest of the world knows where Aaron is. What's your address? What's your social security number?
what's your biggest fears and your
Yeah,
most common password?
your mother's maiden name. Please let me know. Sorry about that. Okay, so getting through this scenario, we've already added software Dante in our core, so we know that our core is the boundary clock. And now if we actually come in and we change our PTP priority one to something less than that magical 127 number, then we are in a situation where the core is now clock leader and the boundary clock. This is really an ideal situation. Um, One of the big differences between PTPv1 and PTPv2 is the clocking messages themselves. PTPv1 only has two clocking messages, a sync message and a T1 message. And as you saw from the very beginning of this, our PTPv2, we have four different clocking messages, and we're actually able to sort of calculate, our offsets. So having the core be the clock leader means that the timing is actually more accurate for this entire system because we're actually dealing with better clock alignment because we're using PTPv2 to be the clock leader. And we're literally then just sending the PTPv1 side of things clock information. Here you go, do this. Um, Again, a little bit of a nuance, but worth talking about. All right, real world scenarios. Well, we talked about this one with John's question that wasn't a question. And we talked about a situation where we got, this is actually a Sennheiser ceiling mic, but the mic just becomes the clock leader. And maybe they even start fighting over it because you've got a boundary clock in the Q-SYS core. Why do we have a boundary clock in the Q-SYS core? Well, you're going to have a software Dante in your Q-SYS core to receive the audio from the ceiling mic. So just logically, as soon as you've got a boundary clock and the clock leader over here, you are going to have some issues. So again, you want to take that step back and you want to change the PTP priority. I'm actually going to go back a slide. You want to change the PTP priority one value of the Q-SYS core so the core becomes both the clock leader and the boundary clock. And you're going to settle that down pretty quickly. All right. So now we've got that same scenario times 5. I actually kind of like this scenario because this is something that you would see. You might have 5 conference rooms. Remember, I talked about the project I did up in the Northwest where we had an absolute mess of these. Joe, I see your question. I'm going to come back to that. So when we're dealing with these 5 systems, if they're all talking to each other, we have the same issue where you have the 5 ceiling mics and they're going to do their little PTPv1 clock algorithm, decide who's the clock leader, and that's going to become your clock leader. So how do we fix that, right? So we can fix that by modifying PTP priority 1. We could theoretically take all of these systems and put them into different domains if we actually had AES67 on the microphones turned on and we gave ourselves the ability to stay in the PTPv2 range. So lots of things that we can do to get into that. Here's where we're going to talk about redundant cores. So Aaron, we're going to address this question. I look at redundant cores and I don't try to make the clock leader something other than one of the 2 cores, but I do pay a lot of attention to which core is my primary. I actually generally will make the secondary core the one with the lower MAC address so that when if the primary fails and it defaults back to the secondary is already your clock leader. So being very deliberate about redundant pairs and which one, and how are you going to be able to tell unless you know how to do that hash with the MAC address? You're not going to be able to tell. But what you can do is go and look in like Wireshark or PTP TrackHound or one of those to sort of see which one, and you'll see that value, or you'll see which one would win. Um, you can do it with some pretty quick tests as well. But that's sort of what I do when I do redundant cores, is I always try to ensure that my clock leader is actually my secondary core, because we want to make sure that if the primary goes offline, it's going to revert to the secondary. There will be no BMCA because the secondary is still the clock leader. And when the primary comes back online, still not going to have any issues with audio because the secondary is still the clock leader. So I think when you get into a redundant pair like this system is showing, you just want to be really, really deliberate about which of those two is your clock leader. And then, in this scenario, they decided to add some wall plates, but I would do the same thing. I would throw software Dante into the primary secondary. And again, just be really, really deliberate about what we're doing and making sure when you're dealing with a network and looking at a network, that you are really paying attention to what your settings are so that you can define with confidence what device is going to be your clock leader and what device is going to be your boundary clock. All right. So this is actually a campus building. We have a whole bunch of classrooms, and this is that situation where we can not only use the PTP priority 1 value, but also the domain to sort of get a result that we want to get. So I'm going to just sort of show that if we have a bunch of devices where we don't have any sort of Dante or anything in the PTPv1 range, then we can actually put those in PTPv2 different domains and have them all end up being separate and discrete systems. And then maybe we make sure that we reserve domain 0 for that one big auditorium that has a whole bunch of Terratech wall plates or Dante IO or wireless microphones or a Yamaha mixer or all of those other things that are going to be talking in that talking on the PTPv1 side, which can only talk to domain 0. Again, these examples may not be 100% real world, but hopefully they're providing some food for thought, because I think it's really important to be deliberate and very prescriptive about how you're going about this when you get into commissioning these systems. Like, hope is not a tactic when it comes to PTP management. I think that's the best way to put it.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I'm stealing
So,
Angela.
yeah. So I'm actually going to stop screen sharing, and I'm going to answer some of these questions here real quick.
Sounds great.
I only stopped screen sharing because nobody wants to see what's on my desktop. It's like a vision into somebody's brain that should never be seen in public. So we're going to talk a little bit. I'm going to talk about QoS, Joe, to sort of answer your question. It's not going to be a 100% answer because I don't think I have enough time, but I am going to just talk a little bit about QoS, because we haven't really talked about it much in any of this. I'm going to start broad strokes here. I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of people at end users where the network person gets on the call and says, I don't need QoS. I've got all the bandwidth in the world on my network. And I look at them and I blink a couple of times and I go, but we need QoS. So I think that it's pretty important to sort of understand why we need QoS. And then I'm going to talk about the QoS preset. So Joe, I'm getting to your answer. I'm just being very long-winded about it, so bear with me. So first things first, I always give this sort of really good example about QoS, and I take a parking lot. So let's just say at the Super Bowl, there's a parking lot. And everybody comes into the Super Bowl and they all park and they do their tailgating and they go to the game. And now they're all leaving. Well, we don't have a capacity issue because all the cars are already in the parking lot. But we have to sort of figure out how we're going to get all the cars out of the parking lot in a way that doesn't take 5 hours, but normally it takes 5 hours. But we have rules. And those rules are, let's just say we have a rule that red cars, we need a red car to leave the parking lot every 30 seconds. My first question I always ask is, can that happen without somebody to manage it, without something to manage it? And the answer is no. Unless you've got an attendant there that's waving a red car through every 30 seconds, never going to happen, right? Well, what if we have other rules where not only does a red car have to go every 30 seconds, but SUVs get priority over other cars? Well, crap, now we've got two rules and we need something to manage it. And that's what QoS is. So now we're going to start talking about the preset part. I'm getting to your answer, Joe. I promise I'm getting to it. The thing is that in order to make QoS work properly, we've got to have rules, right? We've got to have those things that are defined and say, okay, we need, say, our clocking messages, our sync message, those time messages that we've been talking about, we need those to get through first. There are red cars. We need to know that anytime one of those comes out, it gets through. And that is where we go into the QoS and we actually assign those to different levels of priority inside QoS. And I have a chart for that too. I'm going to find that chart. If it freaking kills me, please bear with me.
While you're
And,
looking for that, I think part of one of the things too is as far as QoS settings go, we have in the preferences from a high level view of Q-SYS, in the preferences you can set an automate setting, which
yeah,
aligns our QoS with that a little bit. So
that's
I
the chart I'm
want to
trying to
use the
find.
restroom. So, but yeah, you'll get to that in due time.
That's the chart I'm trying to find where you can actually
Oh,
see what
okay.
those values. But so I think, well, okay, so to give the, I'm going to give the bad number, like I probably am going to give incorrect numbers, but there is a difference between Dante and QLAN. And the difference is that our clocking messages are on two different levels of QoS or two different priority queues. And that's one of those where we actually have the ability on the Q-SYS side to switch our QoS and our priority levels and our priority channels. Because in QoS, you have three different sets of data. You have clocking messages, audio, and video. Dante and us agree on the video, but we don't agree on the clocking messages or the audio. And I think, a while back, I think it was somewhere around Q-SYS Designer 7-ish, we made a decision that we wanted to give everybody the ability to change that QoS preset. And what that does is it changed that DSCP level to match up with Dante's DSCP levels so that they can coexist on the same network. And you'll see video
Showing it
stays,
here.
yeah, video stays the same. I will say that there are actual times where you may want to use custom, and I have one really, really good example. If you've ever done Dolby surround sound, Dolby has completely different QoS or DSCP values that are different than Dante, that are different than AES67, that are different than QLAN. And if you're ever dealing with surround sound data that is digital data, you may actually have to go to custom and set those QoS preset numbers. All right.
I've
And
also
I,
heard we leverage that sometimes on cruise ships too, because there may be some weird other clocking things too, because it's a big place where we're deployed. So cool.
yeah. Okay. Next question. Can you cover some troubleshooting steps to look into when devices on the network are failing to achieve clock sync when using Dante and QLAN across a flat network? I specifically am using Netgear AV line switches with the Dante audio profile, and I've had issues with both the core acting as a boundary clock and as the clock leader for both PTP V1 and V2. Whew, that's a mouthful. There's a couple of tools. You can always use Wireshark. If you use Wireshark, though, a lot of times you have to build a pretty beefy filter because if you're trying to delve down into just those clocking messages, the other tool that I use all the time is PTP TrackHound, also a freebie. And the nice thing about that is it actually will allow you to say, I want to just see the PTPv1 traffic, and I want to just see the PTPv2 traffic. And it really allows you to drill down, especially like you said, on a flat network. I will say one of the other things that I see quite often, we haven't talked about this yet today, but um, when you start dealing with multicast traffic and PTP and audio and all of these sort of streaming video are all in the range of multicast traffic. Another big component of this is IGMP and having like I once had a situation where they were struggling with their clock leader and it was bouncing around and they were having trouble. And the actual trouble they had was they had multiple snooping queries active on the same network. So they actually had multiple multicast tables, and the tables weren't talking to each other. So devices didn't know about each other, and things were getting really, really crazy on a big wide flat network. So just know that the multicast traffic itself can be a concern, and managing that properly across network switch hops, especially like you said in a flat network. So those are some of the things I would look at. I would definitely get out PTP track count, but I would also start with understanding where's my snooping querier. Um, Look at the table the snooping querier creates, which you can always see through most network switches have a network tool that let you see that. And if you're missing devices, you know you've got to start there. So I know it's a little bit more of a vague answer than you wanted, but that's probably the best answer I have for you to start troubleshooting and looking at some of the things to fix it. Um, does PTP have impact on Q-SYS notifications for late packets? Yes, just bluntly, yes. Um, if timing packets, and I can give you, I think, a good explanation. I showed you the math on how a PTP v2 device calculates its offset. Um, if that offset doesn't actually match reality, that's where you start getting jitter. So the device thinks its offset is X, but devices are arriving late and you have an offset that actually ends up being Y, then you start getting jitter because it's not actually adjusting properly for the clock leader and for the offset of the device that you've got. With that said, you'll start to see those messages happening in Q-SYS Designer. They absolutely do affect each other. And a lot of it has to do with in PTPv2, if that offset number isn't actually accurate, you're going to start having all kinds of issues. And then those issues are going to affect all the rest of the traffic. It snowballs from there.
Compound. Yeah.
Is it beneficial to move everything off of domain 0 so that new devices on the network don't start an election when they appear? You can, but you have to make sure that you don't have any PTPv1 devices. So double-edged sword, if you're aware of all your devices on your network and you're aware of all the things that you're going to be putting on the network, you can make that decision intelligently. And by the way, hi, John. How you doing? It's nice to see you, talk to you, hear you. That didn't sound creepy at all. But yeah, but I think you can. I think it also really depends on whether or not traffic needs to be shared between rooms. You can always send sort of what I call unclocked audio, which is that, rather than sending a AES packet or a Dante packet, you're sending basically just, a streaming audio to another core. You can do that. And that would allow you to actually do some of those things. System or PTP trackhead is reporting a second V1 domain default. It actually is probably underscore DFLT. Is this something I should be concerned about? I'm dealing with about 12 or so late packets in the log daily. So I did manage to find this slide. PTP subdomain, the default PTP subdomain is actually called default. It's underscore DFLT. Um, that is what Dante in AES67 mode will automatically default to on the PTPv1 side. It shouldn't affect PTPv2, but if you are dealing with, in other words, I don't think that V1 domain default is actually your problem. That's a known quantity. So whenever you have a PTPv1 clocking domain, the default domain name is called underscore DFLT. That's the essentially the same as the PTPv2 domain 0. Um, that shouldn't scare you. If you want to adjust it or change it, you actually have to use Dante Domain Manager to change it. So you actually have to have a computer running Dante Domain Manager to get off of that underscore DFLT. Don't let that, when you see, if you see that in TrackHound, don't let that scare you. That's your PTPv1 domain. All right. I only went 3 minutes over, Dan. I feel like that's
Well,
a
there's one
miracle.
last one. John slid in here, so we'll call John the
Ah,
last one. Where and when can we get the recording of this webinar? Oh, that's an easy one to answer, John. Perfect. I'll take this one and I'll capture. That's I like to teach breaks and lunch too, so I'll capture those. John, but within a week or so, sometimes depending on how loaded our team is with ISE in Europe, they may the marketing team may have a few things to do, but within a day or two, you'll get a link to this recording and everything. So awesome. Thank you, everyone,
yes,
for
thank you.
taking the time. Angela, thank you for doing the presentation on this. It was easy for me to say. I love how deep you dive into it. Haha, it is a deep dive. That was pun
Oh
intended,
man,
I
that was
guess.
bad.
Yeah, it was bad.
Steve,
But
you need to stop talking to Steve McCary altogether, dude.
that was actually an accidental pun. How was that? So, but anyways, I appreciate everybody attending, and well, let me see what we've got for the rest of the month. I forgot to pull that up, so give me just a quick second. I got it right here. So what we've got coming up. Well, come on, open up. Here we go. Um, just so you. So we've got dynamic audio processing with Steve McCary on the 17th of this month. And then we'll be doing a best practices and gain structure in AEC on the 24th. Keep your eyes peeled for March. We're going to be doing a new deep dive coming out called How to Choose the Right Q-SYS Core Processor, driven from our marketing team. It's going to talk about some of the new processors, the 24F and all of that. So great part on that. And then we'll also see part 2 if you attended last month's in January's how to build and use CSS templates. I've got Skip Mussett doing the CSS part 2 where he actually leverages advanced CSS techniques and things like that. So great stuff. We appreciate everybody attending and have a great day. Oh, we got some thank yous in here. Y'all, great refresher. Great. Awesome.
Thank you.
Is there a quiz for CTS credit? I
Thought
do.
there was.
There might very well be, Ryan. Yes, you will get that. You should get that link mailed to you um, with the follow-up stuff. So if not, just reach back out and we'll try to help out. Yes, there is a recording. We took care of that. Thank you, everybody.
Have a good one.